Member seeking a call? Chris Farfoy. To lower knee, Mr Farfoy.
Excellent speech.
Guys, get it worked out.
Sorry about that. We'll clear up the confusion. Maloney, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, to use a word that David Clark used, this is a cynical and poor attempt by the government part tours to make it look like it's trying to do something for the public good in this bill to make sure to stop New Zealanders smoking. Mr Chair, it is a poor and cynical attempt at trying to make the government look like it's trying to do something to cut down smoking within New Zealand. Mr Chair, it was an honour and a privilege in the 49th Parliament to sit on the Health Select Committee, chaired by Dr Paul Hutchison, and I look around me, Ian Les Galloway was on that committee and Kevin Haig was on that committee to take some real action against tobacco companies and to actually remove tobacco displays from our shops. And as we see, if you go to a service station or a dairy today, you will notice that there are no longer any displays for tobacco, for cigarettes, and that was an absolute pleasure to be on that committee as we worked across this Parliament, apart from the exception of maybe a couple of ACT MPs who voted against that legislation, to take some real action against reducing the number of Kiwis who were starting and who want to, making sure we get as many Kiwis quitting smoking as we could possibly. But this bill, Mr Chair, and especially part 2 of it, is not motivated by trying to reduce the number of smokers or stop smokers starting smoking, Mr Speaker. As the number of my colleagues have said, this is simply a cash grab, and we've said that this government is trying to get hold of its mitts on $528 million over the next 4 years because of its failed economic policies and the fact that it could not and has not raised enough money to come through with its policies. So that's what this part, Mr Chair, part 2, and what this bill is really about. Is it motivated by cash revenue, by trying to raise revenue, or is it motivated by trying to reduce the harm that smoking causes in our communities? And Mr Speaker, I want to take a quick look at the Pacific smoking numbers. As Ian Les Galloway said in part 1 of the debate, roughly or just below 1 in 5 New Zealanders are smoking, and unfortunately for the Pacific community, it is overrepresented in the smoking statistics because, Mr Chair, 27% of adult Pacific adults are smokers. Unfortunately for male Pacific men, that number is 34.5%. So a third of Pacific men smoke, and 1 in 5, just over 20% of Pacific women smoke. So, Mr Chair, in terms of what the revenue that is going to be gathered from this bill, it is surely the Pacific community, by its overrepresentation in the numbers of smokers, that are going to be overrepresented in this bill. Mr Chair, every year 100 Pacific people die each year because of heart disease. Come about because of smoking in that community. 30 die of lung cancer because of their smoking, and 23 Pacific people die of smoking die from strokes because of the fact that they have been smoking. So, Mr Chair, this smoking does have a disproportionate effect on the Pacific community, and that's why we would want this bill to actually take some strong measures motivated by public good, public health good, to make sure it took some swift action and decisive action to make sure, at least in the Pacific's perspective, that those numbers could be reduced, so we could actually use some of that $528 million that is going to come via this bill by increasing the excise tax by 10% in those 4 years, hypothecate it to make sure that it is going into smoking cessation programs and to prevent young Pacific Islanders taking up smoking, because, Mr Chair, those statistics that I pointed out before are just awful, Mr Chair, and being a Tokaloan, that they are the worst of all the Pacific nations in terms of smoking, because 42% of the Tokaloan population are smokers. So from someone from that community, I think we really need to make sure we're targeting our Pacific people, a large and growing population in New Zealand, to make sure we're doing as much as we can to use some of this money that we're raising to target them, to say, don't start smoking or take steps to reduce and stop smoking. So, Mr Chair, I don't think that this bill is motivated by trying to decrease those numbers.
I call the honourable member Dr Paul Hutchison.
It's a great pleasure to